You're live.
Welcome to Slow News Day Live. My name is Steve Poikinen. I'm here in still half burnout Boulder Creek, California. I am joined by my wonderful co-host, Glory Jones. What's happening, Glory? Good morning.
You know exactly what's happening, Steve.
Glory's in the middle of a full-on panic attack because Manchester United and Liverpool are playing right now, and she has to be on a live stream for that. So if you see her like just sort of spontaneously combust, know that it's soccer or football related and has nothing to do with the conversation that we're having, which is going to be in many ways superior.
Take my mind off the fact that Bruno Fernandes played really, really horribly. So I'm really looking forward to this, though.
And I'm really here for the mental escapism. I am here for the fundamental truth, or at least as much of it as we can find out in an hour or so. And to help us with that, founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, one of the more interesting, fascinating, and competent human beings on the planet, Richard Gage. How are you this morning, this afternoon, wherever you may be? Thank you for being on the show, sir.
Yes.
Feeling great here in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Okay, so you're right up the road from me. That's right. I forgot about that. I'm in Santa Cruz County.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So I have seen Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth's documentary film 7 a few times now since it launched, and it is a fascinating and just incredibly well put together, relatively short documentary. And for the people who have deprived themselves of this experience, could you please just kind of let them know what 7 details and sort of the backstory on how it came into being?
Sure. Well, we 14 years ago began Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, and we have been touting the evidence and the eyewitness testimony and forensic evidence of all 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. And when I came across on March 29th, 2006, David Ray Griffin on the radio talking about another theory about how the Twin Towers came down. He also talked about this 3rd tower, which I couldn't even believe. What are you talking about? A 3rd tower came down on 9/11. So indeed, it was a 47-story skyscraper that, after witnesses hear explosions, drops straight down uniformly, symmetrically into its own footprint in under 7 seconds. And that's building 7, of course, right behind your shoulder there. Boy, it'd be great if you could make that thing move, because people would see that it looks exactly like the old hotels in Las Vegas. So we've spent the last 14 years speaking all over the world, 700 times, and also live, and 700 radio and TV interviews, waking the public, the media, the academicians up to this building. So a couple of years ago, 4 years now, we hired the University of Alaska and specifically their chief of their environmental and civil engineering department, Leroy Halsey, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, to do an analysis, an alternate computer analysis, to show people what didn't happen and what could have happened to bring this building down in the way we see in the videos. And so that was a $300,000 4-year effort. And his conclusion at the end of this, which is what this film is all about, is his story about how he went into quite some detail to do a much more honest, rigorous, and accurate modeling of this building's collapse on 9/11. And his conclusion was that in order for this building to collapse in the manner in which we saw, they would have had to have taken out all the interior columns, followed a second later by the exterior columns all at once. So this, of course, can only happen in a procedure we know as controlled demolition. Again, we've all seen the old hotels in Las Vegas. So this film actually interviews Professor Halsey, and he talks about the process that he went through in some detail about the computer modeling with his PhD students, and well, they're candidates for PhD. They were his students, and they have some other startling findings here as well that the film talks about. It also interviews 3 of the structural engineers who are signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth, one of 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all 3 skyscrapers on 9/11 that collapsed. And so and it's also very, very well done. It's made by filmmaker Dylan Avery, who made the famous film, for those of us in the 9/11 Truth movement, at least very famous, been seen 20 million times, Loose Change 9/11. And it talks about the broader scope of activities beyond Building 7 and even beyond the Twin Towers, with the other planes and the hijackers and the drills and that kept the fighter jets away from protecting the East Coast on that morning. Exercises.
Fantastic film. I don't mean to cut you off. Loose Change right now is being used as I don't know, kind of the boogeyman for what essentially is the QAnon conspiracy now. The last couple of months, they've been holding up the film Loose Change, saying, this film started the entire conspiracy theory movement, and it's absolutely ridiculous. And I mean, I personally know both Dylan Avery and Jason Burmis, who worked together to put out Loose Change. And Dylan, of course, did Loose Change, the final cut. And all 3 of us were standing together right in front of the Washington Monument 11 days ago in Washington, D.C., like, while this whole large-scale event was unfolding in front of us. And it felt really surreal to be standing with a couple of the people who have been sort of on the front lines of the 9/11 Truth movement, like, while we're hanging out for a real-time psychological operation. It was just incredibly surreal. What I appreciate a lot about 7, and what I appreciate a lot about Dr. Halsey, is that in the film, they flat out tell you, like, we're not trying to solve the mysteries of the world. What we're trying to do is show you what couldn't happen, right? And it just so happens that the NIST report is 100% what could not happen. And I was wondering if we could talk about that a little bit and get into just how far-fetched the NIST report is, and what sort of suspension of reality you need to have in order to believe that
it was fire induced. And I'm not an engineer, but it involved like multiple types of thermal expansion into a progressive demolition. And with my limited understanding of engineering, it sounds bullshit. Yeah.
Well, let's look at
I'd love to hear how you guys disapproved of that.
Well, what happens when you watch the video, and do try to make that video move if you can.
I've got Sleepy Josh. I sent him the video of the actual tower collapse, and we're going to try and play it at some point.
First of all, most architects and engineers know absolutely nothing about the 3rd worst structural failure in modern history, Building 7. And so we have to show them the actual video, and there's 11 videos of this building collapsing. It's not like anyone disagrees that it happened. But after witnesses hear explosions, this building drops like a rock straight down into its own footprint at free fall acceleration. That's as fast as a brick falling out of the sky. Now, NIST denied this, first of all, in their initial statements regarding this building, because it took them 7 years to do this building analysis. It just should not have taken 7 years. They were working on the Twin Towers during that, so that consumed part of their time, but they're also fumbling this football. But what they say is that when the towers went down, the Twin Towers, there was some debris that was on fire, and there was some damage to Building 7, but not a significant amount of damage to have caused the collapse. What their conclusion is that these fires worked their way around to the northeast side from the south side where they originated on floor 12. And that's believable. But then they say these fires, their fire simulation shows that these fires stayed in and around column 79 for an hour and a half, because they're really trying to bake the steel in there. And yet they also acknowledge the reality that fire protection engineers all around the world talk about, that fire only exists in one place in a modern office building for 20 or 30 minutes. That's all the fuel there is. So it moves on looking for fresh new fuel sources. And by the way, let's note that fire has never brought down a steel frame fireproof skyscraper ever. And there's dozens and dozens of examples of much hotter, larger, and longer lasting fires in these buildings. But NIST ignores that reality. They ignore the reality that fire is only in an area for 20 minutes. And they ignore the reality that these beams and columns are fireproofed with 4 to 6 hour fire protection, which is more than 3 or 4 times as much fire protection as is needed, because there's only 20 minutes of fire. So these realities are all ignored. And then they say this then heated up these long span beams, 50 feet long, near column 79. And then they expanded, and they pushed this girder off of its seat on this column number 79. And then the floor 13 fell on 12, 12 on 10, so on for 9 floors. So you have a progressive collapse, which they're claiming, which we'll get to in a second. And then that completely causes the interior cascading collapse all the way up to the penthouse on the roof. And then this instability travels laterally across the building from east to west, in the football field size building, in just 6 seconds. And so the entire building is gutted, they say, and then the building comes down, like Josh is going to show us in a few minutes here. So
I actually think we're ready. That clip's up and ready to go now.
Yeah, you got to see this.
All right, I'll play it now.
So not one of the those individual parts of NIST's theory could even be true. And I mean, not one of them. The fires weren't as hot as they said they were. They weren't engulfing the building. They weren't even in the area. They were burned out in the area of column 79 for more than an hour before that the collapse itself. And they put in their computer models how they proved this. And by the way, we sued them with a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act, for the input data. Well, what did you put into this black box in order to get these results out that this building came down by normal office fires? Well, they won't release that. They cite that it might jeopardize public safety if we were to release this information. Wait a minute.
No.
Doesn't it jeopardize public safety to withhold this information from the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety? After all, there are hundreds of buildings that are somewhat similarly designed. So if this building can collapse out of the sky after burning for a few hours, then shouldn't we be looking at all our skyscrapers and redesigning them? But not one structural code change has been made since this final report came out in 2008. But in the report, what they do is they put all the heat into these beams in just a second and a half. That's not realistic under any fire circumstances. It forces the expansion of these beams, tearing off their shear studs, and then puts pressure on this girder. Now, they say this girder moved laterally by being pushed by these beams. Well, that couldn't have happened because this girder has 30 shear studs as shown in the shop drawings, which certainly NIST had access to, all of us do. And so they just hoped nobody would miss that omission. Well, even if those shear studs weren't there, the girder would have had to have been pushed 12 inches off of its seat. Why? Because the seat is 12 inches long and the beam is about that long, that wide. And so it would have had to push the whole distance off. But NIST says, no, it only had to be pushed halfway off, where its flange, the bottom piece of the I-beam, would fold and then it fell. Well, that flange never could have folded because they have stiffeners that are 3/4 inch thick that are welded from the web to the flange, supporting the flange. But NIST says, oh no, we didn't need to put that in there because that was put in there to keep the web from crippling, not the flange. Well, it would have done both.
I was going to say, doesn't it sort of act like a collar of sorts? Where with the like the web plate and the flange, doesn't it prevent the beams from doing the exact thing that NIST is claiming, or NIST claimed that they do, like just by design?
Yeah, and well, they're bolted to the seat. The beam is, so the beam would have had to have moved 12 inches off, but it couldn't even have moved 1 inch off. Why? Because there are side plates attached. This is a built-up I-beam, this column, and wide flange column with 2-inch thick side plates that extended out that would have trapped this girder, because as it heated up, it also would have expanded in length a little bit and be trapped behind the side plate. So they ignore all of that and then claim the girder fell off of its seat. Well, the girder couldn't, even if it did fall off its seat, it probably wouldn't even have reached the floor below, because there are two other massive girders framing into that very same column that would have supported that floor to some extent. But they ignore that and say all three girders somehow released, and that impacted the floor. Well, guess what the resulting dynamic load impact is? It's only 60,000 pounds, which sounds like a lot, but structural engineers have calculated that would have taken 10 times that dynamic force to break those shear connections on those girders below, the shear connection to the column. The shear connection from those column seats to the column below. So none of that could have happened, but let's say all that could have happened somehow, and you would have had a progressive collapse, as is claimed by NIST. Well, if there was a progressive collapse of 9 or 40 floors, as NIST claims, you would, those beams connecting to that column and those girders would have pulled in the exterior perimeter structural steel framing system, and it would have crumpled like a beer can. But we don't see any evidence of deformation on the exterior structure anywhere on the order that you'd expect here, or breaking up of granite panels. And there's only a couple of dozen windows that are even broken, and that's after the entire free fall, not before. So this is an extraordinary set of fraudulent processes and conclusions that NIST has come to here. Oh, well, let's say there wasn't crumpling of the exterior structural steel system. Well, how can this instability travel laterally across the building before the building tips? We've taken out a third of its structure on the east side of those columns. Of course, it would have tipped over. That's intuitive. A 7th grader gets that. But then they say, well, let's not worry about that. We don't even comment on that, actually. Somehow the entire inside of the building is collapsed without deforming any of the perimeter. And then the whole building just comes down in the manner that Josh is going to show us one of these moments.
Do we have that?
Yeah, I can play it now. Here,
okay, let's go ahead and roll that real quick. This is the like 31 seconds It's got, I'm pretty sure, like well over 2 million YouTube views. Like it's not an unreliable piece of footage.
Yeah, there's 11 views of this building's collapse. It is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, you can put side by side, as we do in our presentations around the world and to architects and engineers, of Building 7's collapse, and then next to it, the controlled demolition of a high-rise building. You cannot tell the difference. They both drop at free fall acceleration. That means not one of the 80 columns supporting this building gave any resistance. Even if one of them had given any resistance, this building would have slowed down. The acceleration would have slowed down to deceleration, where the actual building begins to show slower and slower acceleration, to the point where it of course would have been stopped, because the cold, hard, intact columns below would provide a massive amount of resistance here.
Mm-hmm. And for most of it falls straight down too, instead of at an angle or collapsing in on itself, like what if you put in the conditions described in the NIST report, like what would happen if those conditions were true. But
and just to let you know, the people who are watching right now, while you were just talking about this, they got to see the video, they got to see the free fall. We couldn't see it because of the way that the software is set up, but they got to see it. And I mean, it is a symmetrical, uniform, rapid descent that just defies everything in that NIST report, which still stands as like the official explanation for what happened to Building 7. Yeah,
it really does. And NIST also tries to tell us that this building, well, they finally admit that it came down at free fall, because members of AE 9/11 Truth embarrassed them publicly in their own press conference that says, this is easily measurable. We did it. It's free fall acceleration, fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky, right? And so they said at the time, before they published, well, if that were true, that would mean the building would have no structure. Right. Yeah. Where did the structure go is the question. And there's evidence of high temperature incendiaries, thermite specifically, in the World Trade Center dust in the aftermath afterwards, because NASA overflights with thermal imaging show 1,400 degree temperatures on the surface of the pile after the collapse. Now, these are the temperatures associated with the hottest office fires, but there's no office fires anymore in Building 7, because the few small scattered fires that were there were extinguished when the building came down. So what are they measuring? They're measuring something deeper down in the pile that is way much hotter than 1,400 degrees. That's cooling off to 1,400 degrees as it's measured on the surface. And the first responders, dozens and dozens of them, talk about seeing molten metal flowing down the channel rails like lava, they say. Well, steel doesn't begin to melt until 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. And jet fuel, which of course no plane hit this building, we forgot to mention that. This is the first building that's ever collapsed due to normal office fires. And so it should be the most highly studied and scrutinized investigation in history, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
But that wasn't done. Well, what else was found in the World Trade Center dust? All of it. There's samples produced and analyzed by the U.S. Geological Survey and R.J. Lee, an environmental consulting firm. They find molten iron microspheres, the diameter of a human hair, billions and billions of them. They have no idea where they came from. What are molten iron microspheres doing in all the World Trade Center dust? R.J. Lee says they're formed during the event, not before by the welders, not after by the iron workers taking the building apart, but during the event. Well, guess what molten iron is? It is the byproduct of thermite. It is the only reasonable explanation for how those molten iron spheres got there. And the pools of molten iron, also described by dozens of first responders and iron workers and the architect of the World Trade Center himself, Leslie Robertson, and many, many others. Molten iron pouring off the ends of the beams as the grapplers were lifting the material out. You can see the molten material pouring out of the South Tower too, by the way, minutes prior to its collapse. We can tell the temperature of this material, molten metals, by their color. And so this is white hot yellow, exceeding 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. But thermite does produce molten iron as its byproduct at 4,000 degrees. So now we have a possible suspect, which was never looked at by NIST, only in their very frequently asked questions, that finally was published years and years later after their reports were published. So this is direct evidence that actually was examined by FEMA before NIST took that investigation over.
That's right.
Yeah, FEMA produced the Appendix C, which is a metallurgical examination of the single piece of steel that they managed to save from World Trade Center 7.
Let's talk about that for a moment, because this is one of the more
cleared away, just like cleared and taken away, so you couldn't analyze any like corrosive agents in the metal or any of the molten iron that you had to gain from, you know, analyzing particles. Like,
yeah,
it was
starting just 2 weeks after 9/11. They carted it off and put it in barges sent to China starting just 2 weeks after 9/11. So forensic investigators couldn't do a proper forensic examination.
And that is
on the one piece of steel, Steve, they what did they find on that piece of steel? Silver dollar size holes in the steel, hot sulfur corrosion attack on the steel, liquid molten iron invading the steel. Well, again, liquid molten iron is the byproduct of thermite. Sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective. If they don't know where the molten iron came from, they don't know where the sulfur came from, and they don't know where the extreme heat came from. So they just ignore all that in the final report, NIST does, and throws out this Appendix C out of the report that they then produced in 2008, their final report from NIST.
And that's another thing that people, in my opinion, need to understand what happened on 9/11 in order to understand what's happening now, in order to understand how we got to this point where we're about to, head directly into technocratic tyranny. It looks like we're being promised it. And until we have an understanding of exactly how events have unfolded and who has benefited and who stood to gain the most, I think we have an incomplete picture of not just our history, but an incomplete picture of real time. And to what benefit is there to remove evidence and make it fundamentally harder to study and understand something of vital importance, like why did this building collapse?
Yeah, and the other evidence that was not included in the final report included the evidence of unignited thermite found throughout all the World Trade Center dust by a team of 8 international scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen. They find these red-gray chips, 1/16 of an inch long or so. They thought they were paint at first because it kind of looks like red primer, but they put it in a heater, a differential scattering calorimeter, and it produces much more energy. So it's active thermitic material because it produces molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres produced and found and documented in the World Trade Center dust by the U.S. Geological Survey. So we know where those spheres came from. They came from these chips, which, by the way, include nanoparticles of iron oxide and aluminum powder. At nano, because they're 1,000 times smaller, these particles, than the diameter of a human hair. So they go, my God, and this material, it's the ingredients of thermite, iron oxide, which is basically rust and aluminum. And it's set in an organic bed of oxygen, silica, carbon. Organic material is what gives the concussive outward expansion, rapid expansion, which knocks things over when used in TNT, for instance, high energy explosive. So it appears that what they've done here is engineered thermite to become nanothermite and nanothermate specifically because of the sulfur that's included. So this is very clear what's going on here and what brought these towers down. The ends of the beams in the World Trade Center that were analyzed also contain the same residue of ignited thermite. So these chips in this peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal by this team of scientists remains uncontested. 25 pages of peer-reviewed paper. And we've been giving that out along with our other materials and petition and so forth to every member of Congress for now 14 years, almost every year. We give them some new form of our evidence. And so this year it includes the film 7 that we're talking about. And although Professor Halsey doesn't go into specifics about thermite or controlled demolition, he makes it absolutely clear that there's no reasonable cause for this building to collapse by fire. All the columns had to be taken out at once. Well, you only do that with shaped cutter charges. And in this case, the use of thermite, an incendiary, which works by means of heat, versus a TNT or RDX or C4, which works by means of knocking things apart. Yeah. And that's what they normally use in controlled demolitions. So it's much cheaper, but it has drawbacks: extremely loud audio signature, bang, and visual signature, flash. So those are very obvious when you watch the films of controlled demolitions. And so they probably, in a deceptive controlled demolition like these 3 towers, this appears to be the technology. This is proven to be the technology that was used to bring the towers down.
And and that's the nanothermate, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I just want to make sure that in my own for my own edification, so that when I talk to people about this later, I don't use the wrong phraseology and then look like a complete idiot. I mean, this fascinates me so much, and I love that Halsey is the guy who is presenting this info, because he's not a part of, like, you know, the truth community, and he's not part of this I don't even like the skeptical community, none of that. He's just a well-respected professor who understands intimately how architecture and design works. He's perfectly suited to explain this. He's pretty gruff about it too. You know, I mean, he comes off great on camera. He really does. But I mean, as an ambassador of this, you couldn't have picked a better guy. And I can't recommend the film enough. Have been since I saw it. And I just, it goes by so fast. You got to watch it a couple of times. You really do, especially if you're trying to, you know, interview Richard Gage and you have to take notes and stuff like that. But I mean, it's tremendous when you present these materials to members of Congress. Do any of them bite? Do any of them follow up?
We've had some follow-ups. Yeah. Jim Himes from Connecticut, actually, I sat down, I played him our video on Building 7 and showed how it came down and showed this evidence we're talking about today. He was blown away. He wrote NIST a letter, says, please send me your response to this information. They write him back and say, oh, don't worry about it. There's iron oxide in the rust in the columns, and there's aluminum in the cladding panels. implying that somehow these materials that were present in the building reconstituted themselves at the nanoscale particle sizes and mixes, and embedding themselves somehow in a matrix of oxygen silica columns.
They gave each other a special hug, Richard. They did.
Yeah. And of course, it's just so ludicrous. So we submitted a request for correction, which you can do with agencies in the U.S. that commit fraud like this. And that's our 100-page request for correction, in which we documented, relative to Building 7 only in this case, the 8 indisputable points of fraud that NIST had. We didn't call it that in the letter, but they wrote back and gave very superficial non-answers to each of the 8 key items, which most of which we've actually already covered in this conversation. So we've now appealed that process, and that goes to the second in command, James Olaf at NIST. So we'll be waiting for his response, and if that's unsatisfactory, we will initiate a lawsuit. Yet another lawsuit against officials. We were already suing the FBI for their they omitted providing our evidence along with all the other evidence to the 9/11 Review Commission in 2015, which was requiring of the FBI to see all the latest information, the evidence that they've collected. And we know they had it because I actually got a letter from Michael Heimbach, Assistant Counterterrorism Expert at the FBI, said, "Oh, this is interesting. This appears to be backed by thorough research and analysis." Well, thank you.
Well, thanks.
That's the evidence we needed. We've also gave them the peer-reviewed paper, which they didn't have such a favorable review of. I got to read that again, but it was another non-response from this agency.
I have like given up on like governmental solutions to this, or to at least like the education process. But I do think that it's incredibly important that people who are going into these positions have an understanding of what happened and get these materials and get briefed on it. I think that they should be hammered with lawsuits. I think that they should be hammered with objections or notices for clarification, or I like it, as much as we can throw at this bureaucracy in order to get somebody somewhere in there, some bright spark, to sort of crack and be like, okay, I'm not going to cover up for these guys anymore. Because that's essentially what all it is at this point, is an extended cover up. And people always ask, like, well, how could you pull something like that off? It's relatively easy, because you let a couple of people know about it and they just train their replacements from then on out.
Well, operations that are dark operations like these have their most trusted people, and they are compartmentalized. They don't know what somebody else is doing on the team. And there are plenty of examples of very secret projects, like the Manhattan Project, which remains secret even to the vice president, who didn't even know about it. And yet it's, of course, the development of our nuclear weapons capability before their use in World War II. So that was there's a lot of reasons. And who are they going to blow the whistle to? Their superiors, the media, which is also part of the extended cover-up. 5 corporations now own 90% of the mainstream media.
Yeah.
And thanks, Bill Clinton.
Thanks, Ed Markey.
Thanks, Ed Markey.
Yeah, we've got the directors of those corporations are the same directors of corporations in the arms industry, the oil industry, the banking industry, and the insurance industry. This is from research from Sonoma State University, Project Censored. Mickey Huff over there.
Yeah. Yeah, but, Project Censored does great work too, by the way. And our friend Lee Camp at the end of every year, he does based off of Project Censored's work. He'll recap the year in censored news. That's always a good thing to catch up on. Oh, I had something and it was good too.
I have a question though, real quick. Just like over the course of kind of your work with architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, I'm really curious to see how kind of the general public received the data from it all, just because I know there's, I kind of lived through it, a huge amount of propaganda surrounding 9/11 in total. So I'm curious as to how the general reaction was to just pure facts, like, no, that's not what happened.
I think most people are predisposed to believe one thing or another about, well, most of them, and then some of them are in the middle about the conspiracy theory that 9/11 was some sort of inside operation. Some people can't handle that information at all. Let's call it 20% of the public will not, including my own friends and family, by the way, will not even be open to engaging in that, because what that does is it means that the world is all of a sudden extremely unsafe. That's the feeling I had in 2006 when I heard this information on the radio in Berkeley, KPFA's Guns and Butter program, which they've now kicked off the air.
Yeah, they have. That was a great show.
Way too much truth there. This threatens our worldview. It turns our world upside down. So people will just launch on me, architects, learned architects. And all I'm doing, is showing them, hey, this is a picture. We have a booth at the AIA, American Institute of Architects, has 90,000 members, of which I'm one. And at these conventions, we go and we show them Building 7 coming down. And I tell them, do you know what that looks like? So they say, yeah, controlled demolition. Well, this is Building 7, right? So they're obviously not familiar with Building 7.
Yeah.
And I said, do you know when that happened? I said, no. Well, this happened on 9/11. And they go, oh, wait, that's not a twin tower. I know what the twin towers look like. No, it's not. But it happened at 5:20 in the afternoon. Then they're open. We start with Building 7, just like you did today, because it gets into people's minds when they see that, oh my God, that's obviously a controlled demolition. You don't have to be an architect or engineer to understand that. And then we show them the evidence for the twin towers, which we haven't even gotten to. We'll have to come back, I guess, and talk about all of that evidence, because it's extraordinary as well. Even more convincing than Building 7 after you look at the evidence, the videos, the freely flying structural steel sections weighing 8 tons, landing 600 feet in every direction, driven laterally out of the towers at 80 miles an hour, clocked by physicists. Gravity works down, not out. 90% of the material at the World Trade Center towers is 600 feet outside, from 100 to 600 feet outside the World Trade Center. The concrete is completely pulverized, 110 floors, an acre in size each. The pulverized to dust. It's not found in pancakes, as we're told down at the World Trade Center. No, it's been pulverized. So that's 2/3 the weight of the building. That's well outside the footprint of the building in the aftermath. So how could it be available to crush the building? Well, these are some of the things we point out to them, in addition to the explosions, 118 and now 156 first responders talking about explosions in the towers before they even collapsed. This is extraordinary evidence, and flashes of light before the collapse. And they go like pop, 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 like in a controlled demolition when they take down a building. That's what I saw. So we talk about these quotes too, and people begin to think about this very differently. You can see the explosions traveling at almost free fall acceleration in the case of the towers, down the corner of the tower, hundreds of explosions so easily seen.
Yeah, no, I recall very clearly watching that footage. I do, and that's certainly a little bit later in the thing. But I mean, I was relatively close to Manhattan on 9/11. I was in Tuxedo Park, New York. It's right across the Tappan Zee Bridge. It's where the New York Renaissance Festival is. I used to do those for a living. I would go from one to the other every couple of months, and anyway. But I was right there for that. You couldn't see the sky for a couple of, or you couldn't see the sun for a couple of days because the debris cloud was so gnarly. And I remember, because we had a couple of friends who, you know, stayed in the campground with us who were in the city that day, who came back, who were close enough to what had happened when Building 7 collapsed to have been like, oh, and by the way, another building went down. And we didn't hear about it again for an incredibly long time. Like, even just routine news reports about Building 7 collapsing were omitted. And I understand that there was pageantry around the Twin Towers going down, you know, but just from like interpersonal communication, nobody really knew about Building 7 for years. And you're so right that it's that at least for me, when I talk to people about 9/11, I use Building 7 as the sort of door opener. You know, here's a building on the same general part of the complex, but not anywhere near either tower that's, you know, what, 5.5 hours of fires or something like that, smoke coming out of it.
Well, it was 100 yards away from the North Tower.
Yeah.
Some debris hit it, but that was minimal damage according to NIST.
Yeah. So even NIST is saying, you know, it like nothing in the NIST report makes sense. And anyone who watches Building 7 goes down, like you were saying, whether or not you're an architect or an engineer, you can tell that's a controlled demolition. Yeah. So if you look at NIST report that says, oh, it's all a result of this one section and one column, all of that caused unilateral free fall, you have to go, okay, no. And hopefully your next thought after no is, now I need to know more, you know, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, that's one reason we have 3,000 architects signed on to our petition. They wanted to learn more and they did their homework. And anybody who looks at this evidence objectively with half of an open mind ends up agreeing with us. We need a new investigation. And most of those sign our petition. But not everybody has an open mind. We bring them other evidence in some of those cases, like the foreknowledge of the building's destruction. We have this group of construction workers, for instance, walking away from Building 7 in the afternoon of 9/11. They hear an explosion over their shoulder. They look back, and then they look straight into the CNN camera, and they say, "You hear that? That building's coming down. Flame and debris coming down. The building's going to blow up." What? That has a few small scattered fires in it. And you're telling us we're going to lose it for the first time in history? A steel frame skyscraper that is fireproofed, it's going to blow itself up? What are you saying here? Well, sure enough, Jane Stanley from the BBC is also announcing the collapse of this building, which is just as clear as Building 7 is over your shoulder, 20 minutes before it even happened. And they even give the reason why. The gentleman says, due to structural weakening when the Twin Towers came down. Yeah. Well, they got their stories mixed up, right? It's just, this information is leaked in advance to these people, what's going to happen, so that they can get their stories all straight. But here, 20 minutes early, I mean, it's extraordinary. When not one steel frame skyscraper has ever collapsed due to fire.
And what was the excuse NIST gave the for both World Trade Center 2 and 7, that
Well,
it was a never before seen phenomenon, wholly unique to these two buildings, that allowed for like one column to send the rest of the structure into free fall?
That's true in Building 7. In the Twin Towers, what NIST says is that the fires, which were just about out by the time of the collapse of those buildings, also indicated by the thick black dark smoke indicating oxygen-starved and cooler fires. But they say they were raging, and that they caused the floor trusses to sag. And when the floor trusses sagged, it pulled in the columns, apparently all the way around, which is ludicrous. But then they say the upper portion, due to the weakening of the perimeter columns around, drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. Now, this is like running a Mack truck into a Volkswagen and saying that the Volkswagen's going to destroy the Mack truck. It doesn't even matter if you turn the Mack truck up and you drop the Volkswagen on it, it's not going to destroy the Mack truck. The lightest part of the structure, which is the top, 3/8 inch to 3/4 inch steel, thick steel versus solid steel, 52 inches by 22 inches at the base, it's a virtual pyramid, structurally speaking.
And it's not a symmetrical structure. This is important to note too for people who are watching. Building 7 itself, it's not like it was a rectangular grid, right? There's a section of it and then an off-center section of it too, correct?
Building 7 is asymmetrical. It's trapezoidal in shape, but I was talking about Twin Towers.
Yeah.
Just to be clear. And so in that case, what FEMA found out, once again, FEMA has some truth before NIST takes over the investigation and throws them out. They found out that the antenna descended first in the Twin Towers. And so their conclusion was that the core columns gave way first. Well, that's absolutely critical. The question is, what could sever all the core columns, which support indirectly through the hat truss the antenna? And I'm talking about a 400-foot tall, 10-foot diameter concrete antenna. This is not any ordinary antenna. And so the fact that it collapses first proves FEMA right originally that the core columns failed. Well, what could cause the failure of all those core columns? Again, we have the evidence of thermite, nanothermite throughout the World Trade Center dust, which proves that. The evidence of molten metal, which turns out to be molten iron, which is, we haven't used iron in our skyscrapers for over 100 years. This is elemental iron. The only reasonable explanation, especially given all the other evidence we're talking about, is molten metal from thermite incendiary, which is its byproduct. So this is extraordinary evidence. And so what happens is that the witnesses hear explosions before the towers come down, like a train running under my feet, and so forth. And then they begin to see explosions in the tower up above, and then they see these material flying everywhere, and the top part doesn't descend and crush the lower part. There's none of the photos or videos show anything like that. The top part is destroying itself. It's telescoping down on itself in the first 3 seconds before there's any movement downward. And then what we see is all these hundreds of explosions, including squibs, which occur 20, 40, 60 stories down below what we're told is a gravitational collapse. These are isolated explosive ejections. Physicists have clocked them at 150 to 200 feet per second. This is explosive speed, not air pressure being produced by this pile driver, which NIST says is responsible for these puffs of air. Well, they're solids. They're exploding building materials. They're not puffs of air. So this evidence is among that which has convinced 3,000 architects and engineers to sign the petition, and thousands of supporters to continue supporting us in the work that we do, like the latest project, getting an inquest into the death of Jeff Campbell, who was murdered on the 106th floor of the North Tower. His family is suing the government, basically, through an inquest petition to the Attorney General in London. And we've raised $100,000 to pay one of the finest attorneys, who happens to also be a coroner who's very impressed with our evidence, and that's going to be submitted this month in the UK. So a very exciting opportunity, because that should show the explosions that killed their sons, the explosive evidence that we've been talking about today, in fact.
Is there a link to that petition and more information on the AE 911 website?
Sure.
Okay,
yeah, it's all there.
We have that link. That link's going in the description, and we put it in the chat a couple of times too. So I want to make sure, because we've cultivated an active audience, Richard, over the last couple of years. And if there's any crew that you could suggest to, hey, help us get this circulating, help this inquest happen, it's our incredible and incredibly good looking audience here at
chat.
Yeah, what I would do is have people, I'm asking your viewers here, to actually go to watch the film that we're talking about today, 7 by AE 911 Truth. It's on Vudu, Hulu, and Amazon Prime, and you can watch it and make a positive review. That would help us out quite a bit.
Yeah, and like, watch it with somebody you love to watch. Like, don't just watch it by yourself. Watch it with people, and then encourage them to go watch it with people. Because again, I can't stress how important it is to understand what's going on in the world right now. We have to understand what happened on 9/11. This is why Jared Beck's going to be back on the show too, by the way. DNC fraud lawsuit attorney Jared Beck, incredibly just bright and really fun to talk to guy. But it's fundamentally important to be able to not just understand what happened on 9/11, but be able to communicate it and to, I don't know, like, we're heading for some weird times, just flat out. And go ahead. Already. I'm rambling.
We're in those weird times this week, as a matter of fact, aren't we?
You're not kidding, man. You're not. Yeah. You're not. And Richard, I know absolutely nothing about your politics, and I'm not going to like even. But what is your take on, I don't know, everything that happened at the Capitol 11 days ago, what may happen at the inauguration? Because the DHS themselves, since like March of last year, has come out predicting a 9/11 scale event, not type, but scope, scale. They've been saying it's going to come from domestic right-wing terrorists, and that a lot of the things that have happened from Election Day up until now have already come to pan out more or less exactly like these DHS memos have said.
Yeah, it's scary. They're associating 9/11 truthers with all kinds of other groups, such as the Patriots, who are trying to secure our freedom in this country, and they're aware. Many of them are aware, but many of our supporters are also on the left side of the equation. So we have a very sensitive dance to take with respect to even forming, much less expressing, our own individual opinions, those of us on the staff at AE 9/11 Truth. So I get into trouble no matter what I say.
Me too.
Regarding other issues.
Yeah, all
it's
the
a real
time.
problem.
You've come to the right show.
Yeah, we're post-partisan, really, because the stuff that we talk about, it is apolitical, and we cover a lot of the national security state stuff. And I'm an activist for Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and free speech outside of this show, and really try to eliminate the left right paradigm about all this, because these aren't necessarily political issues. Like, we should be able to have a conversation not just about 9/11, but about how absolutely ridiculous it is that a pretend insurrection gets to be labeled domestic terrorism and used as the sort of springboard for a Patriot Act 2.0 that's already sitting around waiting in the wings, just looking for an excuse to be rolled out and further restrict rights, further surveil, and further exploit just everyday Americans who, don't want a technopoly running.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened with 9/11. Of course, the Patriot Act was rolled out a couple of days after 9/11. Well, the damn thing is thousands of pages long, and not one of our elected representatives read it before they passed it, overwhelmingly.
Yep.
This is a huge problem. Now any of us can be arrested, like me, for being associated with a terrorist, which is only defined as using force. Any of us can be detained indefinitely without a right to a lawyer, a trial, a jury. So this is a fact, which is a result of the false flag event that we know and we can prove to anybody that is 9/11. So yeah, I'm concerned about future false flag events. We've been through several of them already, haven't we, in the last 19 years?
We really have. And that's almost all of Glory's life. But it's I mean, I was what, 21, I think, when 9/11 happened. Looking at it then, like in the moment, there was a sense, again, because I was at a Renaissance Festival campground, we're sort of outside the norm of society anyway, a little bit more open to seeing things for what they could be as opposed to what the TV tells us they are. And as it was happening in real time, we had the sense that we're not going to get told the truth about this, and immediately George Bush comes out and he's like, oh, they woke a sleeping giant. Bitch, we've been bombing people for 50 years. Who was asleep? Nobody was asleep. Active coups going on in several countries during 9/11. And the explosion of unnecessary, draconian, volatile surveillance and the ancillary industries that have sprung up around it, all of those people who were on the ground floor for 9/11, like Richard Cadlick, now have incredibly important positions either inside government or at corporations that are part of all of these public-private partnerships that we see being connected to Operation Warp Speed and all of the coronavirus, medical industry, and this sort of like healthcare AI driven future that we keep having advertised and sort of handed to us. It amazes me how many people who were connected to September 11th are being rewarded to this day, and yet people don't look at this and go, maybe that's a problem.
Well, I mean, so many people don't know. That's the thing, is there's like this massive blob of propaganda surrounding all of 9/11 and the aftermath of it. Like, obvious, like, okay, so I was born in 2000. I'm too young to remember what the hell I was doing on 9/11, 2001. But what I do remember is going to elementary school, going to middle school, going to high school, and every single day on 9/11 being fed the same sob video of, like, you know, the mother and her daughter having the last call off the plane, and all these gut-wrenching stories of, like, people jumping off buildings. That's designed to play on your emotions and generate a lot of fear and a lot of emotion based off 9/11 and nothing else. No skepticism whatsoever encouraged. Like, if it weren't for me watching the Boondocks, where the first line in the show is Jesus was black, Ronald Reagan was a devil, and the government lied about 9/11, or, you know, just me getting into politics in general, I probably wouldn't have even had any sort of interest in this. And it's like, we feel the effects of this to this day. A couple months ago, I was waiting for a ride from a protest, and literally like 6 cop cars and an undercover just surrounded me and a couple other friends, and we were illegally detained. So, and that's like one of many stories I have about that. But I mean, there's just so much, it's just a whole sphere of propaganda surrounding this whole thing to make people ignore all this, to make people just disregard all this, and to make people have that gut reaction like, oh, 9/11 truth? You're a truther? Like, no, it's like, no, that can't happen. And that's why I'm really glad that you were able to come with like just so much facts, because yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It's been awesome. I really appreciate the opportunity, you guys. I hope people will go to the website, ae911truth.org, and inform themselves first if they're not already. But if you are, then I'm asking people to do something with that. Send our video. There's many videos. A lot of them are free on YouTube at our channel, AE911 Truth, and send that link to every architect and engineer you can find. Everybody else that you know, in fact. This is a grassroots movement, and it grows by millions every year. But we need to be a lot further along by this point to stop the next false flag event from happening.
I couldn't agree more with that, Richard. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today. And we please do come back, and we can do a another round on the North and South Tower, because
Sure.
that would be incredible. And yeah, one more time, guys, go watch 7. There's a handful of different places you can get it, and again, it's Vudu, Hulu, the evil that is Amazon. I do think it's kind of funny using a platform like Amazon to watch a film like 7. Just the irony is sort of delicious. But you don't have to give Jeff Bezos any of your money. He's got plenty. He does. Watch the film with somebody you love. Watch the film with someone that you don't even know. Like, just pull that shit up on an airplane. Seriously. I did.
That's a great time to watch a 9/11 documentary, Steve.
I did that, though. I did on my way out to DC on New Year's Day. I already had it downloaded, and I pulled it up and watched it on the plane. And the lady sitting next to me was like, really? You know?
Because everybody knows the best place to watch a 9/11 documentary is on a plane, Steve.
And so I said, don't worry, it's for work. And
It's work. That's funny.
But that's gonna do it for us. We'll be back this afternoon with Tedros Fikramariam and hopefully a couple other people. Tedros has this idea in his head that the entire country should go on a wildcat strike on the inauguration and ignore everything that's going on around the incoming Kamala Harris and guy with instant grits, where his brains used to be administration. So I'm looking forward to hearing him out and seeing what he's got to say about that. So please come back for that. That'll be 3 p.m. today Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern. And yeah, man, we love you guys. We'll see you soon. Good luck to us all.